My initial interest in meditation has always been very utilitarian. I heard that it could help me reduce my stress, or make me focus better at work, or make me 10% happier. But despite many tries, I've never been able to make the habit stick. On the other hand, my friend Tasshin has been meditating consistently for over a decade. He moved into a monastery and last year did 100 days of silent retreat. Tasshin doesn't view meditation as something purely utilitarian. Rather, in many senses, he finds the practice fun. Although I've been friends with Tasshin for many years now, we've never done a deep dive into meditation. Until now. In today's chat, we discuss different types of meditation that you may not have heard of, common misconceptions about meditation, Tasshin's recommendations for beginners, and much, much more. Let's hop into the chat. I'm James Stuber, and this is the Strangely Earnest Podcast. Tasshin, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, James.
Yeah. Tasshin is a monastic, currently training and teaching at Oak in California, and he's been meditating in some form or another for over a decade now. Is that right?
That's right. Yep.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you first came upon meditation and what that looked like for you?
I started meditating in college about a decade ago. I was 19, and it was basically the short version is I was looking to be happier, having a hard time, and had a lot of social awkwardness and depression and anxiety and things like this, and also a sense of lack of, looking for some purpose or meaning. And I thought that meditation might help with that as well. And so I started meditating, and I was a sophomore in college, and the whole time I was at college, I would meditate for half an hour a day in my dorm room. Just after I'd wake up, I would sit there and mostly did following the breath, or later on I did a Goenka retreat and started doing body scans, but just half an hour a day, and one of those two techniques, and found that it helped me in school. I was able to pay attention in class more, able to stay focused with my reading and work more, and also found life just generally easier. I was enjoying being connected to people at school and being social and enjoying life overall just a little bit more, and found that it was having significant, clear benefits and was worth my time, and enjoyed it. And yeah.
Cool. Yeah, it's funny. I also started meditating in college, and it was also sort of following the breath and this sort of thing, but I never stuck with it long enough for the results to come up. Were you using an app, or was this just of your own volition? Like, what did that look like?
Yeah, I think this was, I don't know exactly the timeline of how mindfulness has been adopted in our larger culture, but my sense is I started meditating maybe like 2 or 3 years before mindfulness. There was this huge boom of meditation and mindfulness. So I didn't have a smartphone, so I wasn't using an app. I read a few books here and there, like Mindfulness in Plain English, and I was watching a lot of videos of Shinzen Young, and I went on a retreat between my sophomore and junior years with the Goenka retreat that I mentioned. And so just a few eclectic sources, and most of them said things like follow your breath, and that was pretty straightforward. So I tried that.
So what spurred your interest in pursuing other forms of meditation? You said you were watching videos of Shinzen Young and you did that retreat. What spurred you into deciding to go to a monastery and train?
A few things that, I was reading a lot about the history of spiritual traditions and mystical practice, and really felt a calling to that, to deepen my practice beyond what was possible with just half an hour a day.
Yeah.
It was a little bit like I was like someone interested in running, and I would go jogging a few times a week for half an hour, and I was interested in being a marathoner or an ultra marathoner, or joining a Olympic team for running or something like that, where it was important enough to me that I wanted to take it to the next level. I wanted to get more serious about it. And I thought that it would be possible to have deeper benefits if I threw myself in more. I was seeing benefits from just half an hour a day. That was excellent, and they were significant. They had a significant impact on my life, my quality of life, my ability to do the things that I cared about, but they were also not enormous. They weren't, I got out what I put in. So I was putting in half an hour a day, and I got some benefits that were noticeable, clear, good, but also not, earth shattering or something like that. And I wanted to see if deeper, more lasting benefits were possible. And for that, it seemed clear that monastic training would be a a good way to go deeper.
So tell me a bit about how you got into the Monastic Academy, and then what the style of meditation there is like, and how that differs from, the typical just breathing that you were doing before.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I say, I was watching some videos of Shinzen Young at the time, and I wasn't really doing his style of practice just yet, although I have done that extensively since then. But he was really giving me a way to talk about what practice was and a way to understand it that I could understand. He's very approachable, and everything that he says makes sense and is clear and is persuasive. And I really liked that, because a lot of materials about meditation are sort of opaque or confusing, and he was just very straightforward. And so I was following his blog. He was blogging a lot at the time, and RSS feeds were still a thing.
Yeah.
And I had RSS reader, and one day I got a notification in my RSS reader that he announced that there was a monastery that was starting up that was going to be using his stuff, that was in Vermont. And I signed up for a newsletter to learn more about it and stayed in touch with them. And that summer after I graduated, I went to go do a retreat with them and really fell in love with the community and learned a lot just in a week while I was there. That week I learned a lot about Shinzen system, for example, that I hadn't really known before. The materials were available online, but I was talking to people that had really actually practiced his stuff and learned about it, and just talking to them, engaging with people that were doing the thing I wanted to be doing. I learned a lot just from their example and from talking to them, and knew that I wanted to come back and train there. And I had already planned to go to Asia to travel with a friend for a while. So that was sort of a course that I'd set, but I knew that when I got back from Asia, I would want to apply there and train. And that's what ended up happening. And yeah, as far as the style, in the beginning, especially, there was a lot of use of Shinzen system. Now we use his system more as kind of a language for describing practice. He has a lot of very specific vocabulary terms that help you describe what you're doing. That's helpful to kind of have collegial conversations between people who are meditators. Like, oh, what are you doing? Well, I do this kind of practice. What are you doing? Oh, I do that kind of practice. There's actually, I know you're interested in movement practices, and with movement practices and exercise and the body, there are so many different ways to move your body and to train your body, and so many different kinds of disciplines. And boxing and competitive soccer are not the same things at all. They're both movement forms, but they're totally different. Weightlifting is different than yoga, is different than kettlebell or body weight training or swimming or something. Those are all different. And it turns out that meditation is much like movement or body practices, in that there's actually a lot of different kinds of styles and techniques and traditions. And so it's helpful to have a language for describing what you're doing if there are so many different ways to practice.
What are some of those different styles or ways of practice? Like what's the weightlifting of the meditation world, and what's the soccer of the meditation world?
Sure. Well, a lot of the different ways are sort of tied to different traditions. So, there's a lot of what I'm familiar with is different styles of Buddhism, but even within Buddhism, there are different styles and many different traditions. But there's also, Western traditions and other traditions and contemporary traditions. And then one way to talk about it that we use at the Monastic Academy is sort of breaking it up into 4 broad categories. So the first is, well, let's just start with the following the breath, because that's an example you're familiar with and most people are familiar with. So that's what we call an observation style practice, which is where you have a focus space, in this case, the breath, maybe at the nostrils, maybe at the abdomen, maybe over the whole body, but you have a focus space, and you are trying to bring mindful awareness to that focus space, but you're not trying to change the focus space. So you're just observing the breath as it is, following it without changing it. And you're trying to bring things like concentration and clarity to that focus space. But there's
so practices like following the breath or doing body scans would sort of fall under this observational category.
Exactly. But with the breath in particular, and also other things, there's another way to do it, which we call cultivation, where there's some positive quality that you want to cultivate, where you're intentionally changing something or creating something that's positive and trying to grow it. So there are ways to change the breath so that they have certain qualities like energy or relaxation. And then there's also things like loving kindness practice, where you're cultivating a felt sense of love or care for self and others. There's a lot of different practices like that. You could consider prayer to be a form of cultivation practice. So that's a second style. A third would be something called inquiry, which is where you ask a question, and it's a question that's not a logical or rational question. So it's not like, oh, it's not a question like, you and I could talk about productivity and I'd say, what's the best notes app that has, maybe it's an opinion or maybe it has an objective answer, but there's sort of a rational account you could give to that. Typically, these are questions that are, we might say, non-rational or supra-rational, above reason. So one simple example would be like, who am I? Who am I? And then you ask that and you have some kind of answer, and then you keep asking. You're not satisfied with whatever the answer is. And then the fourth one would be kind of what we would call do nothing, or like a choiceless awareness type practice, where you're not paying attention to anything in particular and you're not trying to change anything in particular. You're just allowing your experience to be what it is and stopping intention, stopping efforting. You're just open to what's there without trying to pay attention to it in a certain way, without trying to pay attention to a specific thing at all. You're just there with what's there.
Cool. So just to recap, the four categories are observation, cultivation, inquiry, and some sort of non-doing.
Mm-hmm. That's
right?
Exactly right.
And would you consider like a Zen koan or something like that to fall under inquiry, or is that a totally separate thing?
Yeah, you would categorize it that way. And this is just one taxonomy. I've seen other taxonomies that might have more categories or less categories or something like that. But yeah, under this particular taxonomy or categorization system, a koan would fit under inquiry. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool to see how many different styles there are. And even I can imagine within each of these categories, there's many different styles, of course.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And, at the Monastic Academy where you've been training, is it a mix of these different styles? Is it sort of a choose your own adventure type thing, or how is that structured?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most people are doing different things. There's a lot of variety in terms of what people practice and what they're excited about and what they want to do. And there's a lot of license to go in direction that's interesting to you. But you're also working with a teacher. So my teacher is Soryu Foral. Other people are also teaching. I'm teaching myself right now. And so the teacher will typically help you work out what technique you should do and sort of to what end. So a lot of that is based on the person and their relationship with the teacher, but there is quite a bit of variety. And that's, again, why it's helpful to have a really good language for talking about these things, since people are doing such different techniques at different times.
Yeah. What are some things that you think Western society in general misunderstands about meditation? I mean, one of them is that, at least in my head, when I used to do some of this meditation stuff in college, I equated meditation with the following the breath, or maybe doing some body scans. Are there similar misunderstandings about meditation that you see quite frequently?
Yeah, I think having a limited conception of what it is one. There, as we've been talking about, there is a lot more different kind of techniques, and also sort of, you might say, belief systems underlying it. There are a lot of different ways to practice, and some of them are religious or spiritual and some aren't. And even within like the religious spiritual side of things, there's a lot of different approaches, and it doesn't have to be religious or spiritual as maybe one. I think also just there's a sense in popular mindfulness discourse that it's a little bit like flossing or something like that. It's like, oh, this is a good thing for your health that you should do every day. But it's kind of, I don't like flossing. I do it, but it's not my favorite part of the day. It's like, this is a thing that's good for you, for your health. And meditation can actually be fun in a way that I don't experience flossing as. So maybe, I guess some people probably do, but meditation can be this really delightful investigation of so many different aspects of our experience that it's like, it can be like a game or a discovery or a journey or an adventure. And the way that we conceive of meditation can preclude that kind of fun from arising, where it just becomes this tight thing that we feel like we're supposed to do, and out of a sense of obligation, or maybe good intentions to take care of yourself or be less stressed or something, but it's still sort of a self-care activity that's out of this, again, the sense of obligation. And when it's fun, it's fun. So you have to come to that on your own, in your own time and in your own way. But from that perspective, it's like you want to meditate because it's fun.
Yeah. It's cool to hear that perspective, because I think like you said, there's this framing around, oh, like you're feeling unhappy. Well, you should meditate for half an hour a day, and then you'll be a little bit happier, or your mood will be improved, or you might be able to concentrate more. And there's not many people saying, well, hey, this is a really interesting thing to do. This is a lot of fun to try. So it's cool to hear you say that. How would you approach meditation if you had to do it over again?
Yeah, this is something I think a fair bit about, especially now that I'm teaching, both because it's sort of, I see how things that I've learned in recent years would have been useful earlier on for myself, but more importantly, because I'm teaching now and I have to think about, if I meet someone who's brand new to meditation or is relatively new to it, what should I be giving to them that they might not otherwise be exposed to? And certainly for myself, I wasn't exposed to a lot of the things that in retrospect would have been really helpful earlier on. So, as we've been talking about, I started out with following the breath. A year in, I was doing body scans. Both of those things are great. They work, tried and true. In fact, it's funny that we're talking about this because my main practice now is following my breath still. It's become more delightful and amazing over the years in really interesting ways, but it can be very dry and repetitive and like going through the motions for the sake of that. And it doesn't have to be that way. So I think the very first thing I would tell someone, or tell myself when I was younger, is somehow convey the sense that it can be fun, That'd be the very first thing. And that if it's not fun, you don't have to do it. You were talking about how you might want to do it because you want to stress less, or, I was talking about like social skills, or, sleeping better, or performing better at work or something. Those are all good motivations, but I honestly don't think meditation is necessarily the best thing to do for any of those specific problems. Say somebody's having trouble sleeping, it might be that they'd be better off like revving up their exercise routine, or they're unhappy. Yeah, exercise is also great. Or, other sort of more minimal psychological interventions, like, I don't know, doing a gratitude journal. That's something I wish I had started very early on. I think that doing a gratitude journal really gives you a sense of felt bodily emotional happiness that it turns out to be an extremely useful skill in practice. And it's such an easy way to learn that skill because you just sit down and you write things that you're grateful for. There's no confusion about how to do it, and you just learn that skill if you do it. So those are two things, that it can be fun, and then probably start off with something like a gratitude journal. And from there, especially if someone started to get a sense of what it is like to feel good in your body emotionally, to intentionally create those kinds of feelings, then this wouldn't necessarily work for everyone. There are some like notable cases where I wouldn't suggest this, but I think doing loving kindness practice earlier on is a really good thing, especially for people in our culture. Loving kindness is just such a delightful practice and has such psychological benefits that it sort of heals a lot of the wounds that tend to be sort of inflicted in our culture. And it can also be problematic if you have like an abuse background or a lot of self-hatred or something like that. It can exacerbate certain problems, but if it feels approachable and you try it and it's not too hard, then it's a wonderful thing to do. And it can actually be easier to enter certain concentration states through loving kindness than through, say, following the breath. So definitely I would have started doing loving kindness earlier myself. And I think also maybe the last thing I'd say is, at this point in the way that mindfulness and meditation are sort of introduced culturally, there tends to be I'd say a fixation on sitting still. You don't need to sit and you don't need to be still to practice meditation or mindfulness. You can actually do it in all postures. You can do it while standing, while walking, while lying down even. You can even do it in motion through things like yoga or qigong or tai chi. And most Westerners aren't physically in good shape to do long extended sitting practice. It can actually damage your body. And the traditional postures that you would use for seated meditation aren't very comfortable for people who are sitting a lot, and as Westerners tend to. So having a concept that's sort of fixated on seated still meditation can really turn a lot of people off in a way that's not necessary and could even harm people. And so I'd say, like, feel comfortable lying down or exploring standing meditation or, doing walking meditation. All of those are lovely and wonderful and have benefits of their own. And you don't have to sit still to meditate well or to see the benefits of meditation practice.
It's funny you mentioned that because I'm just now remembering in high school, we had this religion class where one of our homeworks was to visit a spiritual center that wasn't part of our faith. And my friend and I visited I believe it was a Zen center.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, we were there for about an hour. And for the first half an hour, they were showing us how to sit in the proper way. And it really turned me off because it was super uncomfortable to sit there and to be in the proper position. And, they would tell you like, oh, you need to put your hands this way and your feet should be this way. And by the time we got to practicing the meditation, I was already super uncomfortable and I didn't like it at all.
Mm-hmm.
So it's reassuring to hear that you can meditate without sitting in a certain way or being still the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to circle back a little bit. You mentioned that loving kindness is a good practice for people to start with. Can you describe what that looks like, or maybe fill in people who aren't as familiar with loving kindness meditation?
Sure. Yeah. I wrote a post about it last year, which you could include in the show notes if you want, but
yeah, for sure.
But I'd be happy to talk about it as well. It's really dear to my heart at this point. It's one of my favorite practices and it's such a joy. So there's the way that it's like typically traditionally taught, which I'll talk about first, and then I'll talk about maybe a different way to think about it that's a little bit more flexible and is more how I practice it. So typically loving kindness or metta is this felt sense of love or care for others that you radiate out into the world. It has this sort of spacious quality when you start to access it. So it's about cultivating this quality. It's a cultivation technique, as we talked about earlier. So typically what you do is you go through sort of a sequence of kinds of people, and you try to cultivate this sense of love or care for each of these people. So traditionally you'd start with yourself, and then you'd move to loved ones or friends or family or spiritual teachers if you have them, people that you care deeply for, that are easy for you to love. And then you go to acquaintances, or which are people that are sort of neutral, you might say, like a cashier at a grocery store, or someone you walked by earlier that day on the sidewalk or something. Someone that's neutral, that you don't feel particularly close to or that you don't dislike. They're just a person in your life, maybe even not someone you know very well at all. You may not know their name, but an acquaintance, you might say, or a neutral person. And then you go to difficult people. So these are people that have hurt you or that you don't like, or I don't know, a politician or something like that you feel strongly towards. You try to send them love as well. And then you close out with sending the same kind of love towards all beings. So you go from yourself to loved ones, to acquaintances, to enemies or difficult people, and then all beings, not just humans.
You're expanding your conception of love towards eventually all beings, but you're working your way up from easy to hard.
Exactly. That's the idea. And you have to be careful with this, because especially in our culture, sometimes people actually have a very hard time sending love to themselves. Yeah. And so if that's the case, you can always end with that or even skip it. And it's the same with the difficult people. If you don't have to send anyone love, if you don't want to, you don't have to send like an abuser or someone like that love. It's more about finding some way to push your comfort zone that feels not too hard for you. So if it's too hard, don't worry about it. It should be easy. It should be delightful. It should be interesting. Maybe there's a little bit of a feeling like you're stretching yourself. When you're stretching your body, you don't want to make your body hurt tremendously, but there might be like a little discomfort. And then you would do that. Traditionally, you'd use phrases. So things like, may you be safe and healthy, may you be free from ill will, may you be full of loving kindness, may you be truly happy. Or more simply, you could just say, may you be happy to each of these people. So you'd use those phrases, and you might also use images. You could use images of seeing these people being happy, remembering a time when they were happy, imagining them in the future being happy. You bring that to mind. And some combination of images and these phrases, words in our mind, images in our mind, create bodily feelings of love and care. So that's the way it's traditionally taught, that there's sort of a sequence of kinds of people that you go through, and that you're using talk and image to create these feelings. From my perspective, the most important thing is steering towards having these feelings in your heart. That can take a while to learn how to do, but there's sort of the stage where it's mental and cognitive, and then it changes so that it's this embodied, felt experience of love. And the most important thing is that you learn the skill of feeling that feeling of love or care which typically it takes place in the sort of the emotional heart or energetic heart, which is sort of in the center of your body rather than your physical heart. And it takes time to learn that, it takes practice. But from that perspective, it doesn't really matter what phrases or images you use or who you send it towards. It's just anything that makes you feel happy, that makes you feel that love or care is going in that direction. So you, from that perspective, you can have a lot of flexibility with who you send love to, what you imagine, what words you use in your mind. The images and words are just like tools or like paintbrushes for accomplishing something, for painting something. And the most important thing is that you feel some kind of resonance in your body emotionally, and anything that you do is fair game. So you don't have to stick to those phrases. You don't have to stick to that order of people. You don't have to use a certain kind of imagery. You can get very creative and playful with what the images or words you use. Anything that makes you feel good is fair game.
Yeah. So maybe you could say the standard template is just that it's a template maybe to get started with, but that's not necessarily the thing you have to be doing if it doesn't feel right for you, or if there's another path that might help you get to that feeling in yourself.
That's exactly right. And even with the feelings, there's it's not even necessarily like one specific feeling, but a whole tone or range of feelings, from just like slight happiness to joy or delight or laughter or care or concern or compassion. And those all have very different flavors, and anything positive that feels good emotionally is fair game as well. And it's a little bit like the difference between having a very set exercise routine and like having a movement practice that's just about like playing. Like you go to a field and like toss a frisbee around, or just like roll around on the grass. And the main and most important thing is that you're enjoying it and feeling good in your body emotionally. And there's a lot of ways to do that.
Yeah, and that's such an important point to underscore, I think, is that aspect of fun and delight, where if you're following a script, you may not be the type of person that is going to follow that script every day for a year to see the kind of benefits that you would like to see. But if it's something that you can feel like you're playing with, that you're learning from, then it's much more of a joy to go into these practices and to continue doing them instead of falling off the bandwagon and maybe feeling bad about yourself for not following the practice.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's well seen. And on the other hand, it can be really useful for people to have a structure, especially when they're getting started. And so one way to kind of balance those things of having the structure and being playful and creative and enjoying it is to like really make use of guided meditations. And there are just so many teachers out there who teach like guided meditations of loving kindness, or really any technique that you're interested in. And if I were exploring loving kindness from the beginning, I would totally recommend finding a lot of different guidances of that practice of metta, of loving kindness, and seeing how different people talk about it and teach it, and seeing what resonates with you. And then you can kind of learn from that what works for you and do it your own way once you feel comfortable.
Very cool. So, circling back to our imaginary beginner who's getting advice from you, would you say to start with Metta, loving kindness, or would you say to start with some other more structured, rigid program? What does that look like?
Well, I'd say you could do any technique. There's a lot of things out there. I mean, I think starting with loving kindness is great, but it might not be for everyone, especially if it's hard to send love to yourself, or you have like a trauma background or something like that. It might be very challenging. In fact, maybe following the breath is easier, or doing another technique entirely. That's totally valid. And you have to use some discernment here, like what feels good to you and what is interesting. And if it feels scary or hard or challenging, then don't do it. The most important thing early on is to develop consistency in practice where you're showing up every day. The benefits of this practice accumulate over time. And it's more important that you show up every day than that you do a specific thing for a specific amount of time. So I don't know, even 5 minutes a day, as long as you're doing it every day and you plan to increase it over time, is great and will have benefits. I would definitely recommend that someone start with 5 minutes a day of a technique that they're actually excited about or interested in or feels good, than, I have to do 20 or 30 minutes or an hour or 2 hours or something. Yeah. If it like sustainability is the most important thing starting out.
Yeah, that's nice to hear, because when you're starting out, even 5 minutes of concentrated meditation can feel really difficult or really challenging. It's
Yeah,
not a
absolutely.
not something that we're used to doing, is concentrating on something for 5 minutes or
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
something specific for 5 minutes.
And that's why it's important that it be a technique that feels interesting too. So, or is exciting or enjoyable. And so I think loving kindness is more likely to be a good default for most people starting out. But, if that feels not exciting or hard or challenging, then do something else. There's many, many, many different kinds of techniques, and you can try different things. And it's more important that you're excited and interested than it be a certain thing.
Yeah. And I know recently you've been getting more into sort of standing meditation and moving meditation. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because that's not something that you hear very often.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because, we were talking earlier about the concept of meditation and sort of the popular conception of it and how that might be sort of limiting. And in terms of the postures, the thing that's most emphasized in at least the teachings that I've been exposed to is sitting and then walking and then lying down and then standing. And actually, that for me right now in my own practice seems totally backwards to me, totally backwards. So that, it would, I would actually recommend starting with like standing and lying down and then moving to walking. And then ultimately, when those are kind of familiar and as well established, then you might do seated stillness practice. So part of the reason I got interested in standing practices is I started to be interested in finding a form of contemplative movement practice. So I was looking at yoga and I was looking at Tai Chi and Qigong and just kind of feeling out what those things were all about. And because I was really interested in these forms and trying to decide which one I wanted to dive deeper into. And I was looking at things like Tai Chi and Qigong and also the internal martial arts. I found something very interesting, which is that traditionally, if you're taught something like Tai Chi or Qigong or Xingyi or Bagua, which are two internal martial arts, they would actually, all of those forms, traditionally, they would have you learn standing practice first. So they would get you into a standing meditation posture. And once you were practicing that consistently and could stand for something like an hour, then they would start to teach you Qigong or Tai Chi, and then they would teach you the martial arts, the inner martial arts. So it was sort of a prerequisite for all these other things that I was interested in. And I was like, oh, well, if that's the prerequisite, I should just learn that. And it turns out that standing meditation is pretty challenging. It's physically demanding, surprisingly uncomfortable even. And and from that perspective, maybe lying down would be a better place to start actually. But it really it builds a tremendous amount of body awareness, which is very useful in meditation. A lot of meditation is really about the body and having a relationship with the body. And it also cultivates energy or chi, which is something I was sort of skeptical about when I first started learning about meditation. But over time, I started to have a felt experience of it in my own body, and then it stopped being something I could be skeptical about because it was just part of my experience. It's like tingling or warmth or pleasure or vibratory sensations that you become more attuned to in your body and that you can notice and also move around and allow them to flow. It's totally normal and ordinary. It's just part of being alive that you have this life force in you and you don't have to talk about it in some mystical way. It's just you're alive and there's this aspect of vitality that you can connect to. And the standing practice cultivates your awareness of that. It also cultivates how much energy there is in the system. It sort of charges you up. And it also allows the energy to flow in natural, healthy ways so that it actually has tremendous health benefits. So, I've had some injuries in my right leg and it's been really helping that to heal. And it's also just been really joyful because over time, as you attune to that sense of energy and it increases, it just feels really good. So it feels like I'm a battery that's getting charged up and it's just very pleasurable in the body. And as much as possible in meditation, you want it to be enjoyable. And if it's pleasurable, it's enjoyable. So, yeah.
That's interesting. Why do you think there's this huge focus on sitting meditation as like the first step versus standing meditation as the first step?
Mm. I mean, there are reasons that sitting is so emphasized. It's easier for the mind to quiet and become calm and still and concentrated. It's easier to see all of the ways that you're not allowing yourself to do that. But especially for people in our culture, it can be physically uncomfortable. It can be emotionally uncomfortable. It can be hard. And that's not actually what you want to optimize for in the beginning.
Yeah.
Seated meditation is probably the best thing to do if you're really serious about meditation in the long run. Like you want to do seated practice in a retreat, for example, or you want to build up to that, but you don't have to start there. And it's not like intrinsically superior or something. It just has certain advantages. I mean, walking meditation has advantages, like it allows you to learn how to have these qualities of mindful awareness in motion. And lying down has benefits where it allows you to learn how to be relaxed and also how to avoid being sleepy. You have to work with sleepiness with lying down meditation. Standing allows you to build energy in the way that we were talking about. And seated practice, allows your mind to focus, to become concentrated, but it's not intrinsically better or the best thing. And you don't have to start there. So I think it tends to be unnecessarily privileged, especially for people who just want to try a little bit of meditation or, see what it's all about. You don't have to sit still, lie down, sit in a chair, stand up, go for a walk. All of those things are totally valid ways of practicing mindfulness and meditation.
Yeah. I think that's so important to hear for beginners, is that the point when you're a beginner is to build that consistency. And to build that consistency, if you are trying different things and you're excited to try different things and you find that one way resonates with you more than another way, then that's the thing to do. And, there might be an optimal path where if you're really serious, then maybe you should start with seated meditation. But if you're going to lose the consistency, if you're going to lose interest in your practice, then it doesn't make any sense to, force yourself down that route. So
yeah, and even if you are serious about it, you'll probably still need to train your body to be able to sit. Things like doing yoga. The original purpose of Hatha yoga was to make the body prepared for long seated meditation.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so it's really designed to help your body be capable of sitting for long times. And as Westerners, we're not ready for that, and you need to train your body to do that. It's quite intense. And I'd also say, yeah, it's good to optimize for what's enjoyable and interesting and what's sustainable. And the sort of the converse of that is, if you're not enjoying it, if it's not interesting, if it's not fun, if it's overly hard, if it makes you not want to do it, then don't do it and try something else. Because there's so many different things out there. You can always make an adjustment, and it's important that it be fun. It doesn't have to be terrible or something that you're doing out of obligation.
Yeah, that's so good to hear. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your recent, well, I guess not so recent anymore, about your extended solitary retreat that you did last year. I think it was in January of 2020. You stepped into a cabin for what turned into 100 days. What was that like? What was your practice like? And yeah, just tell me all about that.
Yeah. So if you do go down the path of getting interested in meditation, then retreat is the best way to deepen. And you can do a 1-day retreat, you can do a half-day retreat. Those are great ways to sort of dip your toes in the water of what retreat is and what it's all about. And then typically a lot of retreats are 7 days or 10 days. There's some 14-day retreats that are out there, even some month-long retreats. But even past that, there are retreats that are much longer. I ended up doing 100 days. I went back in for 17 days. There are people that do year-long retreats, or the Tibetans have 3-year retreats. And sometimes people do those back to back. So there's like 3 years and then another 3 years. And some people are, hermits out there that are just basically on retreat all of the time.
Yeah.
And that kind of deep extended practice where it doesn't even end after a week or 2 weeks or a month is where really deep shifts start to happen, when you have that kind of consistency where all you're doing all day is meditating. And this is sort of like the ultra marathon, the equivalent of an ultra marathon for meditation. You don't have to be an ultra marathoner to run, but it's out there if you're interested. And I was interested. So that's part of our tradition at the Monastic Academy is, several times a year, people are offered the chance to go into extended solitary retreat, maybe for a month, maybe for 2, maybe for 3. I went in, it was supposed to be 60 days, but there was a chance that it would get extended for longer. And we did end up extending it to 100 days. And then shortly after that, I went back in for another 17 days and just did a lot of retreat in the first half of last year. And Yeah, it's really changes things on a deep level when you just have that much like sheer quantity of practice and also quality of practice. And I was working with my teacher. I would go in for one-to-one interviews every day, and that was my main job for that time, was just deepen in my practice, complete the different assignments that he gave me. And so
So are you working with one style of meditation the whole time? Is it like you're only doing sitting meditation, or are you jumping between these things, or what does that look like?
yeah, in that mode of practice, it's helpful to both have a main technique that you're doing, which in my case has typically over the years become following the breath at my abdomen. That's been my main technique. It's my bread and butter at this point. Other people have other techniques, following the breath at the nostrils or whole body awareness or body scans, or there are other techniques out there. You could do loving kindness. People do loving kindness retreats, even long ones. That would be wonderful, really delightful to do. But you have a main technique. Like, this is the main thing you're doing. And then it's also helpful to have a whole host of secondary techniques, so that if you run into a very particular problem, you're like, okay, I know that this works for this. So, say a sense of hatred comes up, hatred for self, hatred for others, then okay, loving kindness is a great solution. Or, I've done a lot with, say, the biomotive technique, the biomotive framework for processing emotions. So if I had strong emotions come up, I could do biomotive and sort of work through that. And then from there, return to the main technique, which is following the breath. And the other thing that's really helpful to conceive of is something like what we call an assignment. So the teacher is like a coach. And if you work with a coach, they will say, hey, you have some shared context of this is what we're working on and why. And they give you something to work on. They say, if you have a tennis coach, they tell you, oh, you should change your serve in this way. And then you go work on that. You go to the tennis courts and you practice serving that way. And it takes a while, but eventually you learn to serve that way. And then they give you a new assignment. It's like, okay, I want you to hit the ball a bit harder or something. I don't know. I don't know anything about tennis, but that's what coaches do, right? They give you something to work on, and then your job is to take that and go and work on it. And then when you finish that, you get a new thing, and until you're wherever it is that you're trying to go. And so I was working with my teacher on different assignments, and then the main technique and all of the secondary techniques are kind of tools for working on that.
Very cool. So is that, what does your day look like? Are you waking up and meditating for, 18 hours, or what does that look like?
In the cabin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the main job is to be practicing all day. That might mean that you're sitting, it might mean that you're walking. I did a lot of running, I did a lot of hiking, but whatever you're doing, your job is to keep a technique going, be working on the assignment, and do that all day long. That's your number one priority. So, one of the really nice things about being in a cabin and doing solitary retreat, unlike a group retreat, is that you can really find your own schedule and rhythm that's different than what you would do on a group retreat. So, on a group retreat, there's a schedule and everyone's doing the same thing at the same time for the most part. It depends on the retreat, but there's sort of a shared collective structure. And then in a solitary retreat, you can make your own schedule, you can follow your own rhythms. And a lot of what I did was just kind of figure out what is my rhythm and what do I want to do when. And, basically my days would look like getting up early, practicing, then I'd have breakfast, then I'd practice some more. Then I found that I like to exercise in the early afternoon and then practice some more. I would go have an interview in the evenings typically with my teacher. And then often I would eat after my interviews. And so it was like I'd have a meal spaced out roughly 12 hours or so. That seemed to be good. It's very hard to meditate with a full stomach, so it helped to space it out. And I also found exercising every day was essential. I almost overtrained. I did too much running and sort of hurt my leg, as I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
But exercising seems to be really critical, at least for me. And getting outside, I would get outside every day and do walking meditation, and being connected with nature is extremely important. But yeah, the main thing is just meditate all day long, whatever you're doing. And you can be in any posture. I could be in my cabin, I could be out of the cabin, but the main thing was to keep practicing.
Tell me more about that connection with exercise and your body and this meditation training. I think a lot of people might misconceive that meditating is all about the brain or all about your headspace.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate a little bit about the role of exercise in your meditation training?
Sure. Well, in the way that I've been taught by my teacher Soryu and other sources, meditation is actually really all about the body. And there are some techniques that involve the mind, but even then they often are ultimately about the body. So we were talking about loving kindness earlier. You use your mind, you use images, you use talk, but that's in service of, at least as I understand it, of creating emotions in the body. And that's when the technique really starts to take off. There are some techniques which are exclusively mental, and those are valid, like analytical meditations, or I have ones on my blog about making decisions or reviewing your actions. Those are great, but a lot of meditation is about the body and coming into more awareness of the body and a relationship with the body. And there's a lot of wisdom in the body that you can learn to access. And as far as exercise, I'd say, well, one, in the same way that it's important to have fun while you're meditating, it's also really helpful to feel good in your body when you're meditating. It's normal, even when your body's used to practicing in stillness, for there to be pain, but you don't want to invite that or like cause it. So just feeling good in your body is helpful, and exercising regularly makes your body feel better. It also sort of, from the perspective of meditation, helps you avoid a whole class of like mental, emotional problems that can get in the way. So I found that just going for a run every day would really improve my emotional health and make me happier. And then I was avoiding certain emotional challenges that I was running into in solitary retreat. So it was just really helpful for my mental and physical health and feeling good in my body. And yeah, it's like, I don't know, I was still brushing my teeth when I was in solitary practice, in the same way you should still exercise and take care of your body. And it's just a good thing to do. And you can even learn how to be mindful and have mindfulness in the running or the whatever it is that you want to do that's a movement practice.
But were you flossing, Tasshin?
Yes. Yeah, I was flossing.
Good.
Yeah.
Shifting gears a little bit, we talked about these four, rough categorizations of meditation. I think one that people in our corner of Twitter are starting to get a little more interested in is this concept of non-doing. That the whole area seems very paradoxical. Do you have any thoughts on non-doing or any type of meditations in that grouping?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, let's see. One thing I'd say is I have done this style of practice, but it's not my main practice. It's not one I've done a lot of. I've done a lot more of the observation category and the cultivation category, not so much of the inquiry or the do nothing categories. Played around with a little bit of them, but I'm not an expert. I would say, well, the instructions can be pretty simple for this sort of thing. It's like, get into a meditation posture. Maybe you're sitting, maybe you're lying down, maybe you're walking even, or standing there. It's all good. But rather than intentionally doing something, you notice when you are doing something and you stop that. So, or try to, and maybe you can't stop that. So you try to stop stopping. You try to stop trying to stop it, right? And you notice all of the ways in which you are doing things, and then you stop doing that. So you don't need to pay attention to your breath. You don't need to pay attention to your body. You don't need to have a certain quality of attention. You don't need to try to do anything. You just observe what's there. And then if you notice that you're doing something, intending something, or directing your attention or your awareness somewhere, you drop that and then see what's there. And so I'd say two things about that. One is this benefits from having done a lot of other styles of practice, where it's almost like other styles of practice refine your sensory apparatus and the different skills that you have. And then you can bring all of those skills and refined sensory perceptions and so on to this other activity of not doing things. Yeah. So it's not in conflict with or contrast to other styles of practice. They can be mutually supportive, where if you've done a lot of one, you can bring the skills from that into another technique or see how they relate or even support each other. The other thing I'd say is meditation has an enormous amount of benefits along a lot of axes of human flourishing. It can help you sleep better. It can help you be less stressed. It can decrease anxiety. It can help you do better work. It can help you just be overall happier. It can help you understand yourself better. It can help you be more equipped to serve people and to help people in the world. But a lot of traditions are about deep spiritual shifts that, from that perspective, these kinds of deep spiritual shifts like awakening or enlightenment or seeing God, or however you want to describe it, these other things are sort of secondary to that or instrumental for that. That's just one way of looking at it. And you might not be interested in those things, but I was interested in enlightenment and awakening, and still am. And if you're interested in that, then it seems that while all of the other benefits I just talked about are good, what's most important is what you might say letting go, or relinquishment, or you could say non-doing. And it's not about creating something or getting something or acquiring something, but it's about stopping doing things and dropping things that you're doing and letting go of things that you've been holding on to. So we have these deep, deep patterns that we're holding on to, and they distort how we perceive the world, and then they distort how we behave. And that's what you might call suffering, when you're perceiving the world incorrectly and you're behaving inappropriately. And if you can instead sort of let go of those patterns, then you see the world more clearly and you behave more appropriately. And awakening, you could say, is letting go of all of those patterns entirely. You just drop them all. And then you're perceiving totally clearly and behaving totally appropriately. That's just one way of talking about it. There's some backing for that in the Buddhist sutras. There are many descriptions of enlightenment in the Buddhist scriptures, but one of them is the relinquishment of all acquisitions, or the relinquishment of all attachments, where you're letting go of everything. And so these styles of practices of non-doing, of doing nothing, can be a way to practice that kind of letting go of these patterns of dropping doing. And it takes a little bit of practice. It's sort of an acquired taste or an acquired flavor, acquired skill, but it might be a more direct way to have those kinds of deeper spiritual shifts. But as I say, it seems to be a little bit easier to access if you've done other styles of practice where there is doing, where there is intending, where there is sort of a purpose. So it's not necessarily a better form, but if you want those deep shifts, it may be a way to get there more directly.
Awesome. Well, we're coming up on the end of an hour. I'd love to continue talking about this, maybe at a later date. Are there any sort of final messages you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Yeah, just to have fun, that meditation can be fun. I've already said it, but I hope that if you take away nothing else from this conversation, it's that, and find a way of practicing that feels fun, that's exciting, that's enlivening, and knowing that there are just a lot of different ways to do that, and trying things until you find what works for you, what you really like. And from there, have fun with it.
Awesome. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, I'm at Tasshin.com, and Tasshin Fogleman is my handle on Twitter, and people are welcome to reach out in either of those places.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll put the links in the description. Thank you so much for coming on and taking the time. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, James. It was great chatting.
Yeah, as always, good to chat. All right, Sierra.
Bye.